Well, welcome back to the Ropes Family Podcast. We got another episode for you this week. Today, we're talking about... Actually, we'll start here. I have Donovan again here with me today. Courtney's out of town. It's summertime. People are all over the place. So we got Donovan here today.
I was the only one around.
You can always count on Donovan to be around. That's the good point about. That's a good thing about Donovan. He's always around. But today we're going to be talking about obedience, which kind of sounds like a bad word to some of us. Like, I don't want to obey, but it's a different. It's kind of a different way I want to talk about. But I want to define obedience. What is your definition of obedience?
Doing what you're supposed to. Simple. Doing what you're supposed to.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just kind of a simple...
Someone who has authority. So
yeah,
I think I looked it up on Google. I don't know if it's Webster's or not. Sorry, Courtney. But it says compliance with an order, request, or law, or submission to another's authority. So yeah, submission to another's authority, doing what the other person says to do.
Yeah.
But the kind of obedience that we're talking about, I think today is... not necessarily talking about kids being obedient to our parents, like my kids it's summertime. My kids are struggling with obedience. I don't even know if my kids know the word obedience. They probably just know the word, hey, stop, no, get down. Funny story today that happened. I was in the other room and Emerson, I heard a loud crash, but I've got 3 kids, so I hear loud crashes all the time. I didn't really react. And then Emerson came in and she said, Daddy, I was riding the lamp like a horsey, and it broke. And then I said, okay. And I was getting ready to go handle that. And then Easton's bringing me a piece of our side table. So there was more than just the lamp that was broken. Yeah. It was so obedience is not the word of the Crab household.
Yeah.
But I think the obedience that I kind of want to talk about is more of obedience to Christ and his authority.
Yeah. But it is built, obedience, scriptures were written for adults. Mm-hmm. I mean, we give our kids Bibles and all that kind of stuff, and we tell them read, like we talked about last week, start in Mark, Matthew, whatever it is. And so we expect them to learn, but the Bible was written for adults, but obedience definitely starts as a kid, and so that's where you learn it. I know, you're trying to teach your kids, it's not always easy. Everybody's different. And I'm the same way, but I don't know where I was going with this, but I was just thinking about, we do have to start, even though we're talking mainly about obedience as adults and as Christians, we definitely start with them as young as we can, or they're not they're going to have a poor idea of what it means,
Yeah, I agree. Like we need to parent our children to learn how to follow rules and teach them to obey, like it says in Deuteronomy 6, right? Yeah. It's, teach them the words and then teach them to obey, right? Yeah. It's not just teach them the words, right?
Yeah.
You've got to teach them the rhythms, the way life works, and you've got to teach them how to follow those rules.
Yeah. And we may not I'm sorry, I'm derailing your questions.
No, you're not.
We may not fully understand even the why. I think about our dogs, for example. Mm-hmm. I'm not equating people with dogs, but when you get one dog, it's easy to make them be obedient. You get 2 dogs, it's more important, like at feeding time. If you have a couple of dogs, instead of just dumping the food out and letting them go, what we do is we pour the food in their container and we make them sit. They cannot, and then they can't start eating until they all sit. And then one of the girls will bring their dog over, and it's the same rule. So now we have 3 dogs. Mm-hmm. And so the other dogs are waiting for the one dog that's not being obedient. But we started that when they were young, and so they figured that out. We don't get in that. We don't get what we're waiting for until we listen. And they don't understand. Mm-hmm. Our dog, they just know that the guy pouring the food made that decision. And that's part of what I'm trying to make that equation with kids and with us as adults. Obedience doesn't necessarily mean we understand the why behind it. We get a better glimpse as we get older, but if we don't learn to be obedient when we're kids, even when we don't understand, how hard is it going to be later on when we're told to do harder things?
I think it's way harder for adults to be obedient, right? Because we're adults.
I know better.
Yeah, I can make my own rules.
Yeah.
You know, I don't need to do what that guy's saying. I can do what I want. You know,
you're not the boss of me.
Yeah, you're not the boss of me. And I think that's kind of the one thing that we set up our kids, or we've been set up as life. You know, we've have all these rules to follow all through our childhood, and then now we have our own authority, right?
Yeah, freedom.
Right. But and you know, and so sometimes that kind of rears its head in different ways and that aren't always the best, right? But I think it's one of those things that we still do have an authority, especially as Christians, and that's Christ's authority, right? And so Christ is who he says he is. He's king, right? And so as believers, we need to submit to his authority. And sometimes we're like, yeah, Jesus is king, but I'm still going to make my own decisions, right? We're kind of flippant with his authority.
Yeah.
It's his authority if we want it to be.
Sure. Well, and, you know, you think about that in the context of, you know, we're sitting here in a church. According to scriptures, there's authority of the church over us as well, leadership of the church. And so, and people do not like that today, you know. And I'm not saying I'm the authority. It's us, you know, that kind of a thing. But you look in the pages of Scripture, who we're supposed to be obedient to first is Christ, and then, but the church has a role, you know. And so when the church is following God's leadership, then we have to be obedient to that as well. I'm going off on a church tangent,
I understand.
But it all kind of plays together. If we're gonna claim obedience to Christ, and we're gonna dig into His Word, then the Word tells us that there are authorities over us, and the church is one of them.
Yeah,
and
that's one thing that I wanted to point out. You know, there's tons of things that are pulling us to they're pulling for our obedience, right? And we've said this in a bunch of different ways on this podcast. They're pulling for our attention, pulling for our time. Things are pulling for our obedience, right? And so we need to be careful where we are placing our obedience, right? Like, what decides our steps? Does Jesus decide our steps, or does other things? What other things could decide our steps, like cheerleading or basketball or whatever, or our phones, like we talked about last week? What decides our steps? Is it Jesus, or is it these other things? And so I want to kind of look at what biblical obedience looks like. You know, we've talked about what obedience is, but what is biblical obedience, and why we should obey Christ. And it's in John 14. I'm not going to read this whole passage, but I'll let you guys read it on your own. John 14. Jesus is talking about He's the way, He's the truth, and He's the life. You know, so Jesus is who He says He is, and kind of going through that. He is the way, right? And you had an interesting point about the way when we were talking about this earlier. You were saying Jesus is the way always, or is it the way right now? You know, and so can you elaborate on that a little bit?
No. You know, there's so many people today in modern Christianity that will look at a passage like that, Jesus is the way, and we'll just say that's purely salvation. You know, obviously Christ is the only way to be saved. But we forget that He's also the way of life. You know, that the moment we get saved, we're on a path. He is the way. And that path is obedience to the one that saves us. We don't just pray a prayer when we're 16 years old or 17 years old like I did, and then, man, I've got my ticket. You know, according to scriptures, we follow the way, and that's who Christ is, and that's obedience to Him. You know, and so it's not just a one and done deal. It is, but it's not. I mean, salvation is a one and done deal, but Jesus always called people to follow. That was His invitation. Follow me, you know. And so
I'm the way, I'm leading the way.
Yeah. And so that's actually my sermon this Sunday. That's, you know, hint, to come to church. But I'll be looking at that idea in part. But yeah, He calls us to follow, to be obedient. He leads us.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Moving on to that, you know, so how do we show our obedience? And I think that is answered in John 15 or 14:15. You know, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. And so what are Jesus's commandments, right? To love God and to love others. So that's a big overarching, the whole law of the Old Testament is wrapped up in that, right? To love God and love people.
Yeah.
And so that's how we do it. And that's pretty simple, but also pretty complex, I would say. Like, it's pretty hard to love people sometimes. Sometimes it's hard to love God if you're not paying attention,
Yeah.
or putting your love for God in other places, like giving your obedience to other things in other places. Right.
Yep. Or picking one aspect of God. I'm going to love the aspect of God that is judgmental.
Yeah.
That not judgmental, that judges.
That's on my side today.
Yeah, that's right. Those guys are not like me, and God is against those. So I'm going to be I'm going to be obedient to this aspect of who God is, and to the neglect of the other side, the mercy, slow to anger. It's easy to compartmentalize our obedience, and instead of love God, love people. That's big, but that's part of the journey, is a bigger faith, deeper.
And then kind of moving on, referencing, the chapter before, and it says, by this people will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. Right. And so that's how we show that we are disciples of Christ, is we're loving other people like Christ loved them. Right. That's where we start. That's the blanket starting statement.
It's not a social media post.
No,
they will know that.
It's not a verse in your Instagram bio, just posting a verse there. It's by the way you love people, and that's the evidence is, obviously the fruits of the Spirit, but it's also the way you love people. Yeah. That's how people can tell. Speaking of people, how people can tell, I have this funny story about at camp. I was looking through some pictures, and there was pictures of me standing in the background, and it was really funny. I was like, man, I look just like my dad standing there. Like, I stand and I walk the way my dad did. And that makes sense, because I'm his son, right? And he taught me how to walk and how to stand, right? And so, of course I'm going to walk and stand like he does, right? It was real funny. We kind of, the crab men, we kind of walk with our chests puffed out a little bit, almost our bellies puffed out a little bit. It's kind of, you guys have seen me stand. If you guys know, you've seen me stand just random. I look goofy with my arms kind of sticking out, or sometimes my hands are in weird positions, like I don't know what I'm doing with them. Like that. I've picked that up from my dad, and my boys. They're going to be doomed to do the same. Easton, if you've seen Easton walk, he's the same way. He just kind of walks around with his chest out, and that's just something we've picked up because I'm my dad's son, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And it's the same way with Jesus. Like, we will begin to look more like Jesus the more we are obedient to him, right? The more we walk like him, the more we stand like him, the more we stand the way he stands, talk the way he talks, love the way he does. We're going to be able to be recognized as Christ's disciples, just like I'm going to be able to be recognized as my dad's son by the way I stand.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. You mentioned that, and I may have said this. My little brother was watching the live stream of Sunday morning sermon, and he goes, "Watch the sermon this morning. You have Dad's hands."
What is that?
I know. So my response was, did our cameraman zoom in on my hands? And I was like, it wasn't a comment about, oh, that was a great point, great whatever. It was like, you'd have Dad's hands. But it's the same. I'm guessing it was mannerisms. The same deal that you were saying about you stand like you're a crab, that kind of a thing. And but we are. There are traits that we inherit, and if we're obedient to Christ, hopefully those things, love in particular, hopefully it shows up, when people watch us,
Right. And then kind of moving on to the next point is, how do we model obedience? How do we model obedience for our kids, for the people, those around us? And Paul says it in just one verse. He's kind of going through a bunch of things in Corinthians, and it's in 1 Corinthians 11:1. Basically, it says, "Be imitators of me as I imitate Christ," and that's finishing up basically 1 Corinthians 10, that passage, and then it ends by, "Be imitators of me as I imitate Christ." And Paul is talking to the church, right? He's talking to he's not necessarily in this passage talking to individuals. He's talking to the entire church. So the church has somebody to look towards to model, that's modeling Christ.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, and he's calling that church out too. If you know much about First and Second Corinthians, that church, they had some church members that were behaving badly. Mm-hmm. And Paul calls them out and he says, and you guys aren't even embarrassed. You're not even ashamed that these people are doing these things within your midst. And so he's laying out what we're supposed to look like as believers, and he's saying, you need to stop this. And so he really is putting it out there, saying, this behavior is not good. But if you just look at me, and that's a scary thing, for somebody to, to want to imitate you is a scary thing. But that's what he's saying. Stop looking at people that are not good examples, and look at me. Look at me. That's what he's saying. I'm doing my best to model Christ. Look at me. And Paul, Romans 7 and following in that area, he talks about how he's not perfect, but he is aiming for perfection in Christ. And so there's hope there that we can become. And Paul is saying, follow my example. Be obedient to this. Sorry.
And a big point to that is be somebody that is worth imitating.
Yeah.
Right? For our kids, for those around you, be somebody that's worth imitating. So you try to be like Christ, do what he says, follow his law, his commandments, read his word, become more like him, be somebody worth imitating like Paul.
You talk about that, the impact, back to you started off talking about our kids and the way we try to discipline them and they see us. They do become in one way, shape, or form like us, and what we do impacts them. I was at a youth camp one time years and years ago, and one of our students was really struggling. He was struggling spiritually, but he was trying not to let that on. And it was an adventure camp, and we came to this point where we had to, as a group, succeed in this thing. If the group didn't succeed, we didn't succeed, kind of a thing, and we couldn't do it. It was not, and he was athletic. I mean, he was a strong kid. And so in the midst of all of that failure as a group, and it was kind of his idea to do it this certain way, which I would have come up with the same thing. It was a almost impossible task. All of a sudden he broke, and he went off, and I kind of followed him as the youth guy. That was my responsibility. And I sat down and talked to him, and what he was struggling with the most was the example that his dad had set for him, and his dad had abused him at one time, maybe more than that, but one time. And it's one of those things, looking back, it's questionable if it was really what he said it was, because I knew his dad, but I had to address what the boy was saying. But it did, that behavior in that one instance when he was younger had impacted him for years, and so our kids are going to pick up on us. We're never going to be perfect, but they are watching us, and they're going to be obedient to some aspect of who we are. That will influence them. And so, like you were saying, this is where this thought came. You said we strive, we aim for perfection. Is that what you said?
We aim for Christ.
Whatever.
Same thing.
Yeah, you
perfection, Christ. Yeah,
you can edit that out too. But anyway, but anyway, our the people around us that are watching us, they're going to be impacted, especially by what we do. I mean, we have authority within the local body and within the community, and whether people come here regularly or not, there's a real potential that they're gonna model what they see in us, and so our being obedient to the call of Christ it's vital. Doesn't make it any easier. We struggle just like anybody else, but
right,
still vital.
Yeah, I agree, and it's the same thing with parents. Like you were saying, like kids are going to pick up on parents, and kids don't realize parents aren't imperfect for a long time, and or they aren't perfect for a long time, and then as they get older, they realize, okay, my parents are broken just like me, you know, and then that's where grace comes in.
Yeah.
And so model grace for your kids is where I'm going with that part.
Yeah. No, that's good.
But it's hard in the moment to realize that what we're doing as parents right now is going to impact them for years going on, you know, especially right now with my kids being as young as they are. It's hard for me to think that far ahead, but I need to think that far ahead of the things that I'm saying, the way I'm parenting my kids is going to impact them when they're older, and it needs to make a positive impact.
Yeah,
it needs to be the way that it's supposed to be, instead of, you know, the way this kid had that interaction with his dad. You know, I don't want that.
Yeah,
you know, and so you've got to be mindful in the way you parent your kids, but you also need to model obedience. And so parents modeling obedience to Christ will hopefully in turn model obedience for their kids to obey their authority, which is parents.
Yeah.
You know.
That's right.
Okay, and that's actually the challenge for this week is model obedience by being obedient to Christ's authority. All right, that's all we got this week. We will talk at y'all later. Thanks for listening. Love you guys. Peace.